as a physio or practitioner working with an athlete, what you can do is you can say, well, look, actually they're strong enough. Their peak forces are, some of the highest in the cohort, but when we ask them to produce that force quickly, they're unable to. Their rate of force development is below the normals for this group or for these rugby players, as an example. And then what you do is then you change the program. So there's no point hammering at strength then, if actually rate of force development is the problem and possibly the limiting factor that's going to stop them being able to protect that shoulder in the right moment, at the right time, in the right space.
Hey, this is More Than Velocity. I'm Bart Pear here with Jordan Oseguera and Ryan Croton. And today we have a special guest on the podcast, Ben Ashworth. Ben and Ryan have actually known each other for quite a few years now. I'm really excited about this podcast because it's always nice to have an expert who is in other fields besides baseball. Ben's in baseball, but has experience in baseball, but he's also, if you're familiar with European football, he's the director of performance for AC Sparta. And he's also got quite a history as a physiotherapist, kind of in the physio world. He developed a thing called the ASH test, which we're going to talk about today, and a number of different things dealing with the shoulder and performance. So, Ben, first of all, it's good to have you here. You have your own podcast called Informed Performance that you co-produce. I urge everybody to check that out as well. And just before you jump in, Ben, I'm going to let Ryan set this up and explain how he got to know you, and we'll just go from there.
Yeah, so today I'm wearing my glasses because I want to be like Ben. Ben and I had met quite a while ago. My first experience going to a winter meetings, actually, with the Los Angeles Angels. I really sought out to speak to him, and we had dinner with him and a bunch of our staff. And we're just talking shop, about the shoulder and the throwing arm and, kind of the advances that he has had through his research developing the ASH test. And for people that don't know what the ASH test is, it's the athletic shoulder test. And essentially you're utilizing a force plate, which I thought was really unique. And this was before I even got exposed to dynamometry, in evaluating shoulder strength and performance from a long lever position, which is different from a lot of tests that were done with clinicians that I've seen that were more in a short lever test, or they were a break test or a make test. But this was just definitely a great area to explore. And we communicated off and on over a series of years. And then we have a mutual friend named Tim Pilote, who is the director of high performance for the Olympic volleyball and water polo teams in strength and conditioning. And he put together this group that was just fantastic called the Shoulder Shindig Group during the pandemic. We were all kind of going crazy. We weren't, we didn't have our athletes to work with and data to study. And so we got together, and it's like I was just so grateful to be on it because there were all these masterminds. But as I mentioned prior to the podcast, I don't want to pump up this guy's tires too much, but I really do believe Ben is at the apex of shoulder performance and health. And he's somebody that's really greatly impacted my career, has really changed my insights in terms of how, we look at training the throwing arm, and we've really talked about this before as far as the state of training and assessment, where there's this conundrum. We're testing strength, but we're training endurance. And there's a lot left on the table as far as that interplay of what we should be doing in our assessment and how we should be looking at programming athletes. So, I want to turn it over to Ben and just get him first talking about the ASH test, how it was developed, where this all came from, because I just think it's the progeny of how we need to look at the throwing arm in the future. And our dynamometer really, is going to evolve looking at long lever tests in addition to our battery of tests that we currently offer. So, Benny, I'll turn it over to you.
Guys, it's a real pleasure to be invited on the podcast. I listened to a few tasters to see what I was in for today. And I still came on to join you. So, it's a testament to the work that you're doing. But yeah, thanks for that very warm and overwhelming introduction. I think, this started, and a lot of my work comes through working with really good people. That's the main thing to say. And so that shoulder shindig's another example of a brilliant way of networking and sharing ideas with good people. I was for a long time involved with some work with Daniel Cohen, Dr. Daniel Cohen, who is a big name in force platform technology, set up the company ForceDex. And he and I worked together at Arsenal Football Club. He was a consultant coming in to deliver our testing with jumping and a lot of the hamstring testing we did. And so we used to pretty much jump on a conversation every week, maybe twice a week at odd hours, just through our natural geekiness to try and understand what the technology was giving us. And those conversations progressed over a number of years. And he was also working with Saracens Rugby Club, big European rugby club based in the UK. And the team there were having some problems with their sort of conventional testing. They were using short lever isometric tests using dynamometry. They were looking at different positions. And what they were finding was that the really super strong shoulders, the shoulders that could bench press 160 kilograms, that, with ease, they could pass all these short lever tests, would go out onto the pitch into a tackle situation. And when they had to go into those long lever positions, they would break down. So that was the sort of culmination of the problem that needed to be solved. And that's why literally on the back of a beer mat overnight, I scribbled some drawings of this kind of what we were doing with the hamstring testing in these kind of short and long lever positions, and then tried to explore how that would look with athletes with a force platform. And came in the next day to Arsenal, went upstairs and did some pilot work on my athletic self. And it seemed to make sense. And from that point then, through this really sharp team, so Paddy Hogben, strength and conditioning coach, Laura Tullock, the physiotherapist there, Daniel Cohen as a sort of consultant overseeing what we were doing, and then Nav Singh, who helped us with the data, we started to test more and more shoulders. And we picked up some really nice stuff very early on, where we found some historical deficits in basically rugby players who'd had surgeries. They had maybe some short-term acute neck injuries that were reducing force production. And we seemed to find that this long lever test, the ASH test, filled, a knowledge space. There was something there about it that other tests weren't able to see or find. And so that's then progressed. We did a sort of non-sexy reliability paper, which is the publication you sort of alluded to. We had to do that to sort of show that worked, and it came out really well. That there was high levels, excellent levels of reliability in the test. And so once we knew it worked, when we're looking at peak forces through the shoulder, we were able to then sort of share that information with everybody in the wider community. And that was always my intention, was to develop something that we could hopefully progress the field. And since then, it's just grown and grown. And I mean, viral is probably not a good word through the lockdown, but basically people were contacting me from all over the world asking, what were my insights in and around the ASH test? What did I know about it? What was normal? What had I seen in rugby players? Had I used it in volleyball players? And so on and so forth. And then, as Ryan said, I was brought in to talk to a lot of teams. Some really sharp people took that on board and have been testing for a while now. So it's gone over into baseball, and it's in the NFL, and it's in sort of the highest levels of European rugby and certainly world rugby and Olympic sport now. And all this work is basically people contacting me and then using what we've learned and applying that in their own space. And some of the great stuff that's actionable is actually from the thought processes developed by other people who were able to use the research to apply it in their own environment.
So I had a quick question, kind of leading into, the next area is the application. So I'm curious, in terms of when you're getting these actionable insights, talking maybe some of your nuggets in training and actually, applying the data, because the one thing that really makes it easy on our end with our particular device is that there is this data-led algorithmic approach to training. We're exporting through our platform what you need to do to improve these deficiencies. And I would be really, excited to hear from you, Ben, about, what you've been looking for in your data and the approaches that you've been taking towards remediating deficiencies and improving performance.
Yeah, so the beauty of the test actually is with the force platform, it's also capable of really accurately measuring rate of force development as well. So we get not just peak force values, but we get rate of force development as well. Now, that hasn't been published as a reliability piece, but there's some ongoing master's projects that have looked into that, and there's some excellent reliability when you coach and when you familiarize athletes in the right way, you get the best results. Mm-hmm. So to give you an example, most of this came from this kind of return to play process back at the start. So how do we know when someone's ready to return to the chaos of rugby and collisions with, say, a shoulder dislocation? And what we saw was that peak force returned quite quickly, but rate of force development was the thing that lagged behind. And we've seen that also in lower limb injuries with hamstrings, with ACLs. It tends to be that rate of force development that, it takes longer to get back. And that might be around inhibition, willingness to actually produce force quickly, all those other pieces of the puzzle. But what that means is that as a physio or practitioner working with an athlete, what you can do is you can say, well, look, actually they're strong enough. Their peak forces are, some of the highest in the cohort, but when we ask them to produce that force quickly, they're unable to. Their rate of force development is below the normals for this group or for these rugby players, as an example. And then what you do is then you change the program. So there's no point hammering at strength then, if actually rate of force development is the problem and possibly the limiting factor that's going to stop them being able to protect that shoulder in the right moment at the right time in the right space, and that means that training can look at things like working on, decelerations and catches and faster, more plyometric actions and ballistic actions in the shoulder, rather than looking at maybe some more traditional loading models. And I think that's a nice example of how you can utilize this test to start to alter thought processes and alter how you then program for an athlete through a return to play process.
Yeah, that's where we're heading in our development of our product, as well as looking at the rate of torque. And the thing is, in baseball, the time at which you're applying your peak forces for the shoulder are happening from foot contact to ball release, and that's about 150 milliseconds. And so we need to capture the elements in terms of how much max strength the athlete has. So baseball is going to be very plyometric. That's just the nature of the sport compared to rugby. But we still have to know what are the max strength capacities, and then how much force can be developed at 150 milliseconds as a guide. Because I think you're right. There is some coaching for the athlete to learn how to push fast and hard. You have to really communicate that all the time so that you get those accurate readings. But even when we look at endurance, evaluating endurance and the ability to repeat that rate of torque development or rate of force development, I think is going to be pretty essential to performance, and not only just health, but velocity. Velocity is like the main performance relationship that we have to shoulder strength, that I see kind of in the coming down the works for us. It's going to give us some really interesting data.
Yeah, actually on that, there's some things I can't talk about, but there's some things I can. And one of the relationships from that shoulder shindig group was Chris back at University of Nebraska. And they're going to be probably one of the leading organizations using the ASH test. And they've only recently sort of taken it on board, but they've massively embedded it in the culture of what they're trying to do. And already what we're seeing there is when we look at, velocities of pitchers who are pitching over 90 miles an hour, there's a really strong relationship with some of the RFD values at those sort of very short time frames that you're talking about. So under 150 milliseconds. And certainly, there's one value I saw recently with a small cohort that's a really strong correlation with pitching velocity of the RFD in a Y position in the ASH test. We've run that before with 90 people who'd thrown a fastball across a competitive season in a major league organization as well. The correlation, over those 92 players was, not as strong, but it was still pretty strong considering it's a test where ultimately you're lying with your trunk on the floor, you're not using your lower limb. So the fact that there's a reasonably good relationship between what is essentially a more sort of arm dominant test, if you like, is really exciting in itself.
I don't know, Jordan, if you have anything to add. I've been kind of hogging this.
Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed that's had a lot of success is I just kind of taken an adaptation of the ASH test, and I use it as a recovery protocol specifically for my starting pitchers. After they, get out of the game, I have them get on the dynamometer, and I'll have them do one max rep, and I'll have them kind of train at 80 to 85% of that max rep for 10 sets of 5 or 5 sets of 5, whatever we're programming out. And this is kind of a question I have, since I was glad we got you on the podcast, was, do you notice that with continued use of the ASH test, you see a really quick kind of degradation of that endurance? Because I've noticed, whether it's a minor leaguer, whether it's a big leaguer, whether it was, a high school or a collegiate guy for me, is I've seen reps 1 pretty good, reps 2 pretty good, and then reps 3, 4, and 5. It's almost like it's exponentially just that endurance kills. And I don't know if that's because I'm doing it post throw as a recovery program, or if that's something you've seen as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really sort of insightful view, and it's really great to hear that you're utilizing the sort of thought process around the ASH test, which is exactly what it's all about. It's like how people use it in their own environment. What we saw originally with some of the early testing was we saw that if you didn't give a 20-second rest between max efforts, then those would drop off. And so, when we're looking at a pure testing or monitoring tool, we want to keep that consistent. When we're doing a reliability paper or reliability study, we want to keep that rest period consistent. But the beauty of that is actually, if you shorten that rest period and you go down to 10 seconds and you look at that repeated effort over time, you've got a fatigue index right there and it's ready for you. So how quickly do they drop off if you do 10 times 3 second ASH tests with a 10-second break? And that could be tapping into that kind of repeat max effort as you kind of describe. I think that's something that's really interesting. It's perhaps more for places where you're looking at maybe monitoring or long-term development. Sorry, you're looking at more kind of return to play and more in-depth monitoring, or long-term development through a sort of athletic program, rather than a sort of ad hoc monitoring where you get the athletes in and out quickly and you get some actionable data. I think that in that case, you probably don't want to cook their shoulder. You just want that kind of nicely positioned, well-timed window into that athletic state at that point in their sort of maybe their competitive throwing program. Yeah.
For me, I like doing the isometrics, post throwing as a part of the training. And I've been doing some reading into how isometrics are actually great pain modulators. And, it's interesting because in baseball, when guys come out of games, they want to start doing isotonic training right away. You don't have to get me started on cuff weights and things that I find, dumbbells at 3 pounds. You already know I can talk to you till I'm blue in the face about some of the inefficiencies of using those tools that don't irradiate the muscle and are really not high load. But getting into isometrics, even our tests can be training specific, and the variation of our ASH test is essentially, we have to make it field specific. So they're in a half kneeling position in an upright trunk, transferring force in these long lever positions. And we call them priming too. I mean, utilizing this before games as well. to prime the muscle. You know, obviously not being on the verge of fatigue. We're only doing 2 reps essentially from pushing on the front and the back, and that's coming in our app. But there's a lot to be gained as far as reducing pain. You know, and you think if you start their training session with some sort of isometric training, the arm feels much better when you want to load it. You know, we want to get to a point where we're, you know, the training, and one of the guys at our company says it best, Matt Unthank, and he just said the training for the arm should not look like rehabilitation. You know, there should be some, you know, some element of grit. You know, sometimes guys are going to have to clamp down, and you know, we want to bulletproof the arm, and people don't get biomechanically, you know, the throwing loads are over body weight after ball release. Like, it basically put your, you know, myself at 220 pounds on the tip of my fingers, and that is the force that I need to utilize to restrain my arm flying out with all my rotator cuff muscles and the muscles that, you know, are secondary to those, and compressing the shoulder joint. You know, how you can do this, I think, is by improving your isometric component, you know. And I think one of the things I see in your training, Ben, that I really like is you do a lot of yielding isometrics, you know, and I've done that with athletes as well. And for those who don't know what yielding isometrics is, it's basically not allowing weight to fall to the ground. So for example, if I had a 10-pound dumbbell in my athlete's arm, and they're standing next to the wall in a 90 position at 0 degrees internal rotation. So basically, or external rotation, my palm is facing the floor and my arm is raised to 90 degrees. I'm holding that weight, you know, I'm not letting that weight pull my arm down, you know, so I'm getting a yielding isometric at my external rotator cuff. And I think that, you know, we're going to be getting to a place where, you know, we need to train that way. And in the pitchers that I've done certain things with, you know, heavier band work, you know, basically walk backs being external rotation, heavy band work, heavy resistance, there's a little bit of grit in their face. And I'm getting a lot of rewards from the guys that I'm working with, because they feel that their arm is less sore and they recover faster. So I know I've talked a lot about, you know, how this can come into play, but I do see isometrics as being a recovery modality on my end.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I'm sure Ben's got a ton more information than I can throw in on there, but I've had really good success in getting guys to bounce back to full strength using dynamometry quicker by implementing isometrics. And then one of the things I like doing is I'll have guys even go into a pull-up and they'll just do isometrics and hold, and then give a good eccentric on the way down as kind of that post-throw recovery. And I've noticed it's increasing recovery. I'm measuring, you know, once a day with these guys by about 24 hours.
Yeah, I think there's so much to be said. I mean, you're preaching to the converted here, because isometrics is definitely one of the biggest tools that I would use. And I think the beauty of it is that, you know, you can control the position, the setup, the start posture that the athlete's in. You can see whether they're compensating or cheating a lot easier than when you're doing some more dynamic work. Plus, the loads are less intense than, say, doing some eccentric work. You know, a yielding isometric by its nature is sort of eccentric in its sort of muscle action from a physiological level. And we were doing stuff with the rugby players at one of the teams in the UK, Harlequins, and a couple of the guys there were getting players to hold 16 to 18% of body weight in the hand. They actually had to pass the dumbbell into the player's hand, and they'd hold it for 5 seconds without yielding, without letting go. And then they'd go around their warm up and go and do something else and come back and do another one. And they'd do 6 of those in their warm up prior to a collision session. Some of the work that I am doing currently as a consultant in baseball, and we're measuring, shoulder force production across a competitive season. And there's a few really nice single case studies around a lot of data that we've collected. And as an example, we saw one pitcher who had external rotation force had dropped off. Internal rotation force was continuing to improve with with just the normal throwing program, as it tends to do. And the day before they pitched in a sort of pre-season game in spring training, they had this massive drop off and a real imbalance between the external and internal rotation force production. The next day they pitched, they had to pull out the game with shoulder soreness. But over the next 3 days, all they did was some heavy isometrics, those exactly as Ryan described, those, probably somewhere around 12% body weight in the arm, not up to the sort of rugby levels of 16 to 18%. But that was enough not only to take those force scores back up to their sort of start of spring training values, it was enough to actually rocket them up to a much higher place within 3 days. And they were back pitching again, on a sort of 5-day rotation, and their scores were maintained. And I think it just shows you, Ryan, a little bit, it talks to some of the stuff you've said there around the sort of pain modulation, the capacity to reduce the inhibition. Something there around that player was allowing him to develop internal rotation force, but external was dropping off. Now, was that some subclinical pathology? Was that some, small soreness that they were sort of managing? Whatever it was, the effect of that sort of potent neural stimulus was enough to engage and recruit and allow them to access their full capacity. And part of that, I think, is down to that kind of analgesic effect that you get from that Ebony Rio and her group have described with the lower limb.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to ask you next, before we get into this section, I'm just going to make a comment that, one of the things I want to identify the gaps in what I've seen with the clinical aspect of working with a baseball player. So, you present a good indicator that, when an athlete has shoulder soreness, okay, typically in the professional world, there's a fear, right? There's a concept of like, we will do no harm to the athlete through our programming. Strength and conditioning gets a little bit more aggressive because we want to be able to stimulate the athlete to make advances. So there's some stress there. But what you're telling me is what I think athletes need to do first is differentiate, is this a tendon problem? Because if they're doing isometrics and they're getting an analgesic effect, it's a good differentiator, in diagnoses to know, is this a rotator cuff tendon problem, from something else? And getting the athlete into the isometric kind of milieu of training right away, I think, like what you said, it's living testament. It can get the athlete to return faster, and there's never going to be a pitcher in the history of the game that will never have soreness in throwing. It just doesn't happen. I mean, research even shows that 50% of all pitchers are going to be sidelined. So, in the United States, there's like 16 million baseball players. Let's just say, half of those are pitchers. That's going to be 8 million people that are going to eventually be out of competition for an arm injury. That's going to happen. And so we need to come up with better ways that we can get to the training right away. There's this weakness. And, I love what I'm hearing with you and the work you've done with that team is to be able to show a new pathway that you can take into the practices of physical therapy, strength and conditioning, athletic therapy, to get the jump start on remediating any strength deficiencies. Because if our initial reaction is he's sore, let's do nothing with him. Now, what we're doing is we're really prolonging the inflammatory cycle. We're prolonging training because the athlete we're not doing things to reduce pain and still give stimulus. I've talked to some people, and maybe it was you, Ben. There's been some people, I think, in the lower body world, might be Glenn Stewart, another guy has been in AFL, real well-known guy. But when a hamstring injury occurs, they put the athlete in a non-provocative joint position. They have them do light level isometrics right away to start reducing pain, bridging strength, helping some of the fiber qualities. And so I kind of want to, because you've been inside the walls of professional baseball, you've seen some things, obviously do not give names, but I really want to see from your perspective, where you see there are gaps in knowledge in practice from the training side, the sports medicine side, in your opinion, because I know I've talked a little bit about it, but you've been, invited into some of these teams, and I'm curious, if you were getting given audit, what do you come up with?
Yeah, I think I just want to sort of clarify like one thing. I think the beauty of coming from a physical therapy background and then going through into sort of doing strength and conditioning, the reason for doing that in the first place was because I was sort of underwhelmed with how far physiotherapy could actually take someone through the whole continuum of return to performance. And I was working with some brilliant strength and conditioning coaches. And that's what led me down the route of really challenging my own thinking around loading. And so I will always start with this do no harm approach of like, okay, we've got to screen out these things, look at them clinically, et cetera, and make sure that we look at appropriate radiographic evaluation to make sure there's nothing serious. But once we've cleared that, then really it's a case of, well, what is best? Is it a passive lie on a bed and get some treatment, or is it an active, what can we do to get some load? And specifically around tendon stuff, we know that all those other things are just adjuncts. They're just the 1%ers that allow us to do a good loading program, which is the thing that's going to help them. So I think that's really important to quantify. Like, so the thing to say about the baseball teams that I've been involved with is largely it sort of self-selects. It's the people who reach out and want to talk to me are the people who are really forward thinking, and they're looking for an advantage and they're looking for something that's going to help them. So, I'm working with teams. I'm not working just with strength and conditioning coaches. I'm not just working with athletic trainers. I'm working with performance teams. And there's really nice, it's really good to see there's a really nice interaction between performance teams in terms of how this is managed, athletic trainers collecting data and then applying, heavy isometric loading protocols to their athletes is fantastic from my side, because that's the sort of way that I like to work as well. So we've hit on the main thing there is that I don't think shoulders are loaded heavy enough. Like that would be one of my biggest considerations, because we worry so much about high forces. But essentially, why is a shoulder going to break down? Shoulder's probably not going to break down because it's not moving really nicely through a rotation pattern at low resistance. It's probably going to break down because at the key points within the throwing action, when there's high accelerations, high torques, high velocities, high forces, that's where they're going to break down. And so we've got to make sure that we get in enough load into those players that when they have to use it in the shoulder, that they've got that buffer against sort of the forces that they're going to have to produce. And, that's, I think, one of the biggest things I see as a potential gap, or at least, a refreshing movement towards adopting this kind of philosophy, I think is something it's progressing, and some places are doing it better than others.
Yeah, one of the things, you kind of touched on another area, and I was very fortunate when working with the Los Angeles Angels to be in a position that was interdepartmental as the director of performance integration. And I had Jordan involved with me as the pitching analyst, and he was observing a lot of the medical data and the biomechanical data. And you're really communicating that there is a very strong collaborative effort, it sounds like, with the teams that have been bringing you in, and people are all, they're hungry for this knowledge and information, and working together and communicating with the strength and the medical side. And, that's kind of, I wanted to bring this back to our app, because that's something that I think is important and would help people like you, help organizations having a central place to look at the data and understanding what the key metrics mean to communicate from, because that could be a potential place of breakdown. Usually what happens in the pro sports setting, and could happen in college too, is that you have your strength camp that's like increase load, increase load, increase load. And then you have the medical side that's decrease load, decrease load, decrease load. And sometimes they don't have commonality in the data together. And I think too, you being in there with these teams and being an intermediary is very helpful. And that's something that, we electronically want to be able to replicate is get people bridged together, and learn, what kinds of things that they need to do collaboratively to remediate an athlete, because the goal is how fast can we bring an athlete back to their baseline or make them even more superior. That's the common goal, and it maybe is a combination of increasing load and reducing load. But I think, what you're telling me is, I think clinicians have an unbelievable qualitative sense. If you put your hands on an athlete, you are going to feel things so much more differently than I would, so having that piece is super important. But we also have to have the objective information, the data-driven information, being able to combine those together. I think creates for a beautiful program. I'm sure what you're doing when you're with these teams is they're starting to bridge those connections, and I think that too is what's going to advance the industry, in my opinion.
Yeah, 100%. The ability to share that data, transparently across the whole performance team, so that anybody involved in that athlete's care and return to play, or just general monitoring of their healthy athlete, to be able to have that available and to be able to trust that data. So I suppose there's also this kind of evolution of teams around this, how they handle the information. It takes about 3 years to, weave a decent monitoring process into the fabric of an organization. And that's something that I've seen across, a number of different roles now. When I was the British judo head physio, it took about 3 years before the London Olympics. When I went into Arsenal and we were looking at mitigating against hamstring injuries, it took us about another 3 years before, it's just the 3-year rule, right? Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is there's probably around 6 months where you really can't press the go button on this data because you don't know what it's telling you. And you've got to buy in and play the long game, where you're looking at a long-term surveillance, understand what these tests are telling you about your athletes, understand what that means, what's the sort of bandwidth of what looks like normal, what's strong and what's weak. And I think the other thing that, I've seen and the best teams are doing that separates them from the rest is that they're combining some of their data they've had for a long time, like lower limb data, jumps, ISO mid-thigh pull. And then they're combining that with the upper limb data and looking at almost like a reductionist model of, well, okay, can you generate good force production from the ground? And then, have you got enough force capacity to decelerate the arm or mitigate or basically decelerate those forces that you are able to produce from the ground? And when you look at those and you plot those on a kind of quadrant, you'll see players that just aren't accessing enough lower limb strength or force production, and therefore they're overloading the arm, and vice versa. We're probably producing too much lower limb force, and then, the arm can't cope with it. And those teams are the ones that found some really interesting cases. And I think that's where this kind of work in monitoring is going to go, and looking at how that force transfer is captured is probably one of the biggest advances I've seen. Yeah,
that's a really incredibly important feature of sports science. So we call that, what Ben's talking about is something called causal inferences. So it's basically it's a correlation between a change in one variable and a change in another, in a simplistic terms. But that's important because you're right, when we're connecting, and this is where we want to get to, is connect all these different elements: subjective scores, competitive information, even percentile ranking of ability, into understanding how this manifests into changes in arm strength. Gives us more of a global perspective, because I know you said reductionist, but I think it's very more complex, when we're looking at, all these determinants in an athlete of what changes their arm strength, and we are focused, if for us, we're really focused on the distal chain. We know that there's going to be changes. Everybody's going to be different in their movement, their anatomy, their interrelation with regional interdependence from their body, their lower body, their midsection, their upper body, and the shoulder. But we want to make sure that that part of our kinetic chain is really strong. So I also think in the future, understanding what weakens it is going to be an important process to our performance programs, in the future. So I really love hearing that, that kind of those insights. We need to get to better, we have some metrics that we look at as like the strength velocity ratio. Now how are physiology and competitive data connecting together? Does an athlete have an appreciable amount of strength relative to their velocity? Because that's also an important hinging factor for us, because if they don't, we know velocity is a risk factor for injury. So I can see all these different things happening in the future. It'd be unbelievable to have a large collaborative effort for us, seeing how our tool works, and how people like yourself and other masters in the field of overhand performance, can put our heads together and really dive in and figure out what changes matter and how quickly we can execute on them.
Yeah, I think that the stuff largely parallels the lower limb work that's gone on. So around hamstrings, we know that if you got higher force production in hamstrings, it's your likelihood of sustaining a hamstring injury in field-based sports, as an example. The other thing that helps, as well as sort of Nordic hamstring training or other ways, there are other ways of loading a hamstring, of course. But the other thing is actually running fast, running at 90 to 95% of your maximum has a protective capacity. So, if you're looking at replicating that within the throwing arm, actually throw protect you against throwing fast. But as long as you've got enough strength or force production capacity in the background, if you don't, and then you repeatedly throw, then that's going to suffer throughout a training block or through a competitive season. And that thought process is something that we've looked at with a lot of sort of football studies and field-based hockey and other things, where we see the strongest athletes basically sustain performance for longer throughout competitive cycles. And I think we're going to see something very, very similar when we do some studies around that with the throwing arm.
Nice. I mean, for me, I got no further questions, because you hit the nail on the head. You said strength matters most is what I'm getting from it. And so I'll turn it over to Jordan or Bart, but I'm going to keep my mouth shut, because that was a good clincher for me.
Yeah, I got a ton of notes. Like always, whenever I hear him talk or read something he's put out, I get a lot of things that I want to start trying off of it. So I really appreciate the time.
Fantastic. Well,
Ben, I was just going to say thank you. I think we could do it again down the road. I'm sure we're going to have some questions around this. And, like I was saying, we want to hear your questions. If you're listening to this and thinking about, hey, how do I apply this? What do I do here? Definitely submit your questions, and we'll get them answered one way or another. Like I said, you should check out Ben's podcast as well, called Informed Performance, that he co-produces, if you want to dive into this a little more. And Ben, you got anything else to say before we get out of here?
No, I could carry on the conversation. It's been a real pleasure. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, definitely. We enjoyed it as well. And until next time, take care.